The latest craze in the mental health space is to break generational trauma or generational cycles. Generational trauma is overrated. It's more about generational cycles that we seem to be intent on wanting to break away from. But here's the thing, right? If you don't understand the wisdom behind the generational cycles that raised you, you will discard the wisdom with the cycle, and that leaves you at a disadvantage in trying to create better than that. So when we set out to break generational cycles, we need to understand first and foremost what it is that we're getting ourselves into, because most people don't realize this. They assume that, yeah, we are like the new generation, we're going to do it differently and we're going to do it better than the way we were raised and all of that sort of thing. But they don't realize what they're setting themselves up for, and I'll come to that in a few minutes. The other thing that we don't realize is that if we don't understand why we are averse to or at odds with the generational cycles that we think we need to break, all we're doing is we're setting ourselves up to make exactly the same mistakes, just in a completely different way. So we'll get creative in making the same mistakes again, and then we'll blame them for not having equipped us to do it better. So when we talk about generational cycles, what are we talking about? Sometimes it's seen as traditions, but we don't see it as traditions, we see it as oppressive cycles, oppressive practices or customs or cultural norms. Sometimes it's just about not knowing how to find our place in that space. Sometimes it's because what our generational or our cultural norms, our family traditions ground us with, kind of leaves us at odds with some social circles. And then we look at those social circles and we think they're better than us, and we can't operate in that space because we like this and like that and like that, and that's why we have to break away from it. Sometimes we adopt crazy notions like gentle parenting. Gentle parenting is a well-intentioned bad way of parenting. And we're starting to discover that as well, because we're starting to see how gentle parenting raises children who have a very low level of resilience to be able to deal with adversity, and a very high level of entitlement because they feel as if it's their right to have an opinion about things that they actually don't fully understand. So that's another topic for another day, gentle parenting, or parenting in general, in fact. So coming back to the generational cycles, the first thing you got to do is understand what it is that created the cycles that you believe you're part of. Because at some point, that cycle wasn't in place. Someone established it, and we don't establish a new way of doing things. We don't establish customs and traditions because for the sake of it, or because we're just trying to be important to something. And there might be some people who do that, but that by and large is not the norm. The main reason why we tend to do this is because we see a certain value in it within the context of that social setting or that time that we're living in, right? So when we start respecting tradition for tradition's sake, that's when we start imposing ritual instead of benefit and wisdom. I'm going to say that again. Hopefully I can explain it simpler. If we fixate on the fact that this is the way it's always been done, so we mustn't change it, we focus on the fact that it has to be done that way, not why it was done that way. And that's the beginning of generational cycles that eventually become redundant or oppressive, or even backward, I would go as far as saying. So the biggest problem with generational cycles, and the ones who are trying to break it, is that we don't understand the wisdom behind it before we want to challenge it. And that's a norm that I see across the board, is that there's always people who are championing causes because they want to break away from something they don't fully understand or appreciate. And then what they're trying to replace it with, they don't fully understand or appreciate the consequences of that. And then they create new problems instead of solving old problems. That's the biggest challenge with generational cycles. And I'm calling generational cycles not generational trauma, because trauma is what we take from an experience. In the moment, it might have felt traumatic, but what we take from it is what determines whether we're still traumatized by it or not. And I've covered that in a different episode as well. The point is that I've had a number of people who have come to me and said that there was childhood trauma. And when I asked them to describe what they experienced as childhood trauma, it was maybe not having enough visibility with a parent or both parents. Maybe it was they were excluded from certain social circles. Now, as unpleasant as that is, it's not necessarily traumatic. Because the moment you start labeling every unpleasant experience as traumatic or as toxic, you are actually breaking away or giving up the ability to have a meaningful discussion about it. And I'll tell you why. When, for example, with how we have this tendency to call people toxic these days. If you call someone toxic, why are they toxic? Are they toxic because you label them as toxic, or is there something about them that is really toxic? Is it because you're at odds with them? Is it because you disagree on something? Is it because they're not giving into something you want them to give into? So what happened to all the other stages of toxicity, so to speak? What happened to annoying, irritating, frustrating, repulsive, offensive, aggressive, abrasive? There's so many other ways of describing behavior besides toxic. But I think because of our limited vocabulary and because of this victim mindset that is pretty much pervasive in the mental health space these days, that's why we go from 0 to toxic, 0 to abuse, 0 to trauma. It's because everything is framed in such an extreme and aggressive way that we attach almost a sense of violence to it, a sense of aggression and powerlessness and oppression, that we attach all of that to something that is just disagreeable for us. And that is a lack of maturity on our part to be able to have a healthy understanding of why someone else's humanness might fail them in a moment that we need them to show up for us. And that's why nowadays every second person is a narcissist, and every second other person is suffering from bipolar, or is bipolar, or is suffering from anxiety, or suffering from depression. It's because we don't bother to understand why it is that they feel that way or behave that way. We just want to label. Because the moment we label, it makes it easier for us to deal with. It makes it easier for us to relate to. It makes it easier for us to respond to. It makes it easier for us to draw boundaries. And the boundaries thing is another ridiculous thing, but we'll get back to that as well another time, hopefully. There's so much to talk about, right? But here's the thing, right? So when we want to consider breaking generational cycles, we have to be very purposeful about it. Because if we're not purposeful about it, all we'll know is what we don't want, but we won't know how to achieve what we do want. That's the critical part. There's no shortage of people who got married and decided, I'm not going to be like my parents. I'm not going to be like my mother, or I'm not going to be like my father. Great, no problem. What did you just sign up for that you don't realize? You signed up for figuring it out by yourself because you only know how you don't want to be. You have no idea how you want to be. You know why? Because unless, and this is a very rare exception from my encounters with people and life, unless you've had a healthy alternate role model to the parent that you don't want to be like, you're going to have to figure out how to be the parent you want to be. And that's when you start realizing that it's not all sunshine and roses. Parenting is not for wimps. It's not for the meek. It's not for the whimsical or the idealistic ones. Parenting is what gives you a reason to understand why it is that life sometimes throws curveballs at good people that causes them to behave badly. And if you don't realize this before you get yourself into that space, you're going to try to prove a point until the point you're trying to prove breaks you down in a way that you never saw coming. So, breaking generational cycles means that you have to look back with understanding, not with judgment. Judgment is easy. Judgment is looking at something and saying, I don't like it, or I think you're offensive, or I think you're wrong. That's easy. Because you can just compare them to some other standard, and you can say, well, see, compared to that, I'll write you off. However, doing something with their judgment, when you look at someone and you see them behaving badly, and you decide, okay, well, they're behaving badly because of potentially this reason or that reason. Do I want to do something about the reasons for their bad behavior, or do I want to just challenge them for behaving badly? When you want to break generational cycles and you look back at your parents with judgment, you're effectively doing the latter. You're saying, I reject your parenting, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to do it differently. Not just differently, how I'm going to do it better than you. And that's when you start setting yourself up for pain that you never ever saw coming. I can't count the number of people that have come to me and said, and they've been married for like 10, 15, 20 years, sometimes even longer, and they tried their best to be that kind, gentle, understanding parent, and they don't know how it is that after so many years they turn out to be exactly like their parents. And that's what you do, is that when you know who you don't want to be like, and you don't have a healthy understanding of why it is that they were that way, you won't know what it is about your efforts and your good intentions that might be setting you up for exactly the same outcomes with your children. So if you don't understand the wisdom of the generation before you, you will lose the wisdom and you'll discard the method. But generational cycles or generational trauma is so fixated on discarding methods that we want to come up with these new concepts, these fancy, lovely ways of gentle parenting and liberalism and giving a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old an opinion on what their life should be about and what boundaries should look like and what acceptable behavior and modesty and self-respect should look like. Seriously? That's what happens when you lose the wisdom of the past. You don't recognize how it enabled you to have a voice in critical thinking, to make a decision about what you think does or doesn't work. And then you just come up with this open-ended libertarian kind of approach to raising children that doesn't equip them for life. And then they go struggling because when life hits them hard, outside of that protected cocoon that you try to create for them in the gentle parenting space, it looks like this turned into a discussion about gentle parenting, but it's not. You'll see. We'll move on to it, onto some other things in a minute. But when you raise them in this space that you think is going to be so powerful and so resilient and everything else, they will struggle when they get into a real relationship of their own, and they need to show up in a way that the other person is not going to create space for, where they have to actually claim their space, or where they have to meet expectations that they might think is oppressive. And then they're going to feel empowered, and they're going to reject, and they're going to become offensive, and they're going to become like, we claiming our space. And all they're going to do is they're going to destroy good relationships for the wrong reasons. And what you actually did was you broke one generational cycle and you started a new one. You didn't actually improve on the generational cycles. One thing that comes to mind about the way we judge our parents or the previous generations is that I've yet to come across a single example where, when we look back at our parents or their parents, that they didn't, and I'm talking about the ones who show up. I'm not talking about the ones who absconded, right? The ones who showed up, the ones who were there, who were present, who did the grind every day, despite their failings and despite their preferences and everything else. The one thing that has always been true is that there hasn't been a single parent who actually showed up that tried to give their children less than what they had when they were children. Think about that. So even if you had it bad, chances are very, very good that one or both of your parents had it worse than you. And chances are their parents had it worse than them. So at some point, someone dropped the ball about paying forward the wisdom and the benefit of the generational customs and traditions. And when that happens, that's when you come up with gentle parenting that then breaks away from a whole history of wisdom and understanding and tradition and custom and roots and identity, and you set someone up for just being the odd one out. Why? Because they have no foundation, they have no roots, they have no sense of belonging, no village to lean on. So you get all of these people who are struggling for an identity leaning on each other, and the next thing you know, they're choosing pronouns. It's not me mocking them. I'm telling you that this is what happens when you don't give your children a healthy grounding point. They go out struggling to find their identity. And then when they struggle to find their identity, because they can't figure it out, they end up demanding that others must accept them the way they are because they think this is just the way I was created. I can't help it. This is my natural disposition. This is my natural inclination, all of those sorts of things. And in that moment, you abdicate accountability for your agency, for your ability to choose who you want to be and why you want to be that way, simply because you were raised in a way that didn't even give you sight of the fact that you had that option available to you. So be careful when you want to set out discarding the wisdom of the ages because you think you know better. Be sure that you know better before you want to go and change things. So first look to understand what was the reason for the previous generations being as harsh or being as absent or being as emotionally inaccessible as they might have been. And then when you understand that, you'll see the human in them, and that will inspire the human in you to be more human to your child without discarding the benefit and the wisdom of boundaries, of discipline, of respect. And respect is something that is not good manners. It's not being polite. Respect is much deeper than that. Respect is about having a genuine respect and reverence for what it is that, or who it is that you're dealing with, for what it is that you're receiving, for what it is that you are capable of offering, for what it is that you make yourself available to. Respect, not method, not ritual, not tradition, not custom, not protocol, not any of those wonderful things that are rules-based. It's about how you connect with the essence of the goodness of something. So be careful about misconstruing all of these things and assuming that because you saw a clip on social media or you saw some guru pretending to be wise, that you suddenly know better than your parents. And parents, remember that if you don't like what you see in your children, you have to first reflect on what it is that you might have done that might have given them reason to adopt that perspective, so that you can create space to have that conversation and course correct. Or else you may end up believing that they just disobedient and it was nothing you did, and you won't realize your blind spots. And that's why essential to all of this generational cycle breaking and changing and re-establishing new norms and all of that is healthy communication between the generations. But if you set out in life, and I promise you this is true about everything, if you set out in life knowing what it is that you don't want to do, that's only your starting point. It's a good starting point, but understand it's only your starting point. It doesn't in any way prepare you for how it is that you need to achieve what you want as your endpoint. What you want is your goal, your outcome. And that's the problem, right? So when you don't know why, you won't know how moving forward. You're going to have to figure it out by yourself. And you're going to be so confident about believing that you're doing it right because this is all well-intentioned and everything else. There's not a single parent that wasn't well-intentioned. Even the parents that spank their kids to the point of it being close to abuse, I'm not condoning it. But I'm saying in that moment of them spanking their kids in that way, they thought they were doing the right thing. So if you choose not to spank your kids, you might think you're doing it for the right reasons, but then you need to be sure that you have something else to have influence over your kids. Because the spanking was there because they didn't have any way of figuring out how to influence the kids to avoid the bad things in the first place. So, if you don't have another way of having a meaningful engagement to establish trust and self-respect with your children so that they will respect your opinion, they will respect your guidance and your instruction, then you don't have the spanking, which I personally disagree with. I don't think spanking is a good way to go about disciplining children. But you also have no other way of ensuring that they're not going to have to learn the hard way about everything in life because they think they know better than you. And that's not easy. It's not easy to be emotionally available in a way that doesn't feel as if your role is being threatened or undermined. And it's also not easy to be assertive and firm in your role as a parent, because you are a parent. You are not a friend, right? You're a parent, first and foremost. It's not easy to step up into that role if you are trying to be a friend because you don't want to upset them. So strike a balance and know when it is that you need to claim your space as a parent and when you need to be available to have a discussion as a confidant, not as a friend. You are not your child's friend. Otherwise, you give them a very unhealthy idea of what it looks like to establish a parent-child relationship, or what it is to know your place relative to the wisdom that you've accumulated versus the wisdom that someone else brings to the table for you. So we need to just keep that in mind, right? Now, one of the things that I find really interesting about this whole generational cycle thing is that the ones who try to break generational cycles, one of the biggest challenges they face is imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is basically our self-doubt when we're trying to step up into a bigger role, into a bigger space, claiming more agency for ourselves, or trying to punch above our class, so to speak. What it means is that if I want to achieve more than the peers around me or my siblings or whoever it is, I'm going to question, like, who do you think you are? That's the internal narrative that runs through. It's like, who do you think you are? What makes you think that you are capable of this? What makes you think people are going to respect you in that role? What makes you think people are going to even, like, cooperate with you or recognize your achievements? And then you start self-doubting, and then you overachieve, or you exert yourself in a way that just loses the sweetness of what it is you're achieving, and all sorts of things. And that's what you need to be aware of, is that when you're breaking generational cycles, you are setting yourself up to go against the grain about a lot of things. And when you go against the grain, you assume that people are equally invested in breaking generational cycles, you'll find that you will be at odds with the people around you. Because more often than not, if people around you are not invested in breaking generational cycles, and they're just trying to get by, what they're going to feel when you want to do it differently is they're going to feel as if you're rejecting them, as if you're rejecting their ways, as if you think you're better than them. And if you're not prepared for that, you're going to assume that they just don't like you, and they are against you, and they are judging you, and all sorts of things. So those are some of the things that you actually run into when you want to break generational cycles. So understand why first and foremost, and then understand what it is that you're setting yourself up for. Be aware, be mindful, be open to learning, be open to criticism, be open to correcting, be open to being corrected. If you're not changing generational cycles. You're just replacing what you don't like with something else that is unhealthy, or even probably more harmful than the one that you're trying to break. But because you want to be validated for your struggle, because you want to be appreciated for how you're trying to give them better than what you had and all of that, you're going to lose sight of the impact you're having. And that's the problem. So the biggest challenge in all of this is when you're raising your kids in this space. Let's assume for a second that you're getting it right. You're getting it right to raise your children in a way that is healthier and more grounded and more emotionally developed than what you were raised as during that phase of your life. You need to realize that puts them at odds with the norms around them, because your norms around you are determined by your close circles, your social circles that are more family ties and extended family, and your support structures. Which means that it's going to be that much more difficult for others to relate to them, or for them to relate to others, or for them to even strike up healthy relationships with them. Not only that, but also the village that you now need must support you and your children. That village is very likely not going to be your traditional support structure. Why? If your traditional support structure, your family, your extended family, your siblings, your children's friends or cousins, all of that, if they're not on the same page as you about what you're trying to achieve with your children and your family unit, chances are you are going to be up against a lot of resistance, a lot of counterproductive discussions and arguments and things like that. And if you're not prepared for that, that can leave you depressed, because you're going to lose hope about being able to have this idealistic future for your children that you were hoping to create for them, because you suddenly realize that, hey, the world is not cooperating with me. So when it comes to family ties in your village, understand that the moment you're breaking away from tradition, you're also breaking away from the village that subscribes to that tradition. So how you go about doing that, if you do it in a way that you outgrow them, you're going to experience isolation. You're going to experience struggle, you're going to experience exclusion and all sorts of things. If you do it in a way that actually demonstrates value, brings them along with it, you have healthy conversations in the process about what you think is problematic, why it is that you think it needs to change, and then you have healthy discussions about how you can try to change it. Totally different story. Then you have a chance of establishing new healthy traditions to replace redundant traditions. But the underlying benefit and wisdom of the old traditions can be maintained, because now you're looking at it and you're thinking, well, okay, that had its place, it was good, but in the contemporary times that we're experiencing, it just doesn't enable us or empower us to be effective or to be relevant. So we need to break away from that way of doing it, but maintain the reason for doing it. It's like family gatherings. Is it becoming a token gesture, or is it something that is still establishing unity and harmony and understanding and bonds of kinship? That's what you need to be focused on. What is it that you're trying to establish and maintain that works, that was good, versus what methods are you looking to discard? So, for example, if your parents might have been unnecessarily harsh and abrasive in how it is that they were disciplining you or correcting you or pushing you to do better at school, for example, the fact that they were pushing you to be better and do well and be more effective at your studies and things like that, that's not a bad thing. So you need to be sure that how you're going to ensure that you're doing that with your children is still going to be effective, but just the method, the harshness in that is not going to be carried across with it. That's the difference between changing the method versus discarding the entire thing and thinking you know better. Because that's what a lot of people do. They look at how it is that they might have been dismissed because, brown people problems they always talk about. If you get an A, it's like, why isn't an A+? If you get an A+, it's like, yeah, you only got 90% or 95%. Why couldn't you get 100%? It's always like, why couldn't you? Right? Or that's not such a big deal because, look, they also did the same thing. There's always an emphasis on what you didn't achieve rather than celebrating what you did achieve. And that's what you need to be careful of, is going from that extreme to don't worry about it. As long as you pass, we're okay. And then you establish mediocrity in their mindset. And then they become lethargic and they become complacent. And then later on you look at it and you think, why are you not ambitious? Why are you not more committed? And why don't you have more like oomph and excitement and enthusiasm for your life? You got everything so easy. That's the problem. When you make everything too easy, it's like that old example of the butterfly. If you cut the cocoon when the butterfly is struggling to emerge from it, you'll actually kill the butterfly because it won't get an opportunity to develop fully. So if you take away the restraints and the constraints and the struggles that life is supposed to give us as a part of our growth, that builds our resilience, our understanding, our wisdom, our tenacity, and all of those wonderful attributes that make us human. If you make it too easy for your child to get through their developmental years, they will struggle when they're adults. They'll need things to be safe. They'll need things to be ordered. They'll need things to be structured and predictable, and they'll need people to comply with them and to cooperate with them and all sorts of things. They won't have the resilience to deal with things that just hit them out of nowhere. And that is how it is that your good intention can end up causing harm rather than good. So be careful about how it is that you want to break generational cycles, and understand first why the generational cycle is there. If you don't understand that, you're going to struggle with figuring out how to do it better. You might think you're doing it better because less stress, you're easygoing, you're such a chill parent and all of that. But then the proof is in the pudding, right? You'll see the successes of your efforts or the failures of your efforts when you see how it is that your child can regulate themselves in a healthy relationship, or whether they always find themselves in unhealthy relationships. And that is a combination of your efforts and the village around you. So be careful about what village you surround yourself with to assist in raising your child. And that's why single parenting then becomes such a big challenge, because the single parent doesn't have the proverbial village backing them up if the village's stigma about being a single parent is not a healthy one. And so on, and so on, and so on. That's how breaking generational cycles becomes very complicated. So if you want to break generational cycles, understand what you're setting yourself up for. Don't expect it to be easy. Don't expect it to be something that your children are going to fully cooperate with, because you're only going to discover what it means to be a parent, or understand why it is that your parents might have dealt with certain things the way they did, when you are faced with the same situation or scenario or same demands. And that's when you're going to appreciate, that's why they did that. Now I understand why they gave me crap about that. Now I understand why they were on my case about that. Now I understand why they didn't allow me to do that or go there. Because it's only when you have a vested interest in someone else's life that you start appreciating why someone who had a vested interest in your life showed up for you the way they did. Look to see the human in your parents, and that will make it easier for you not only to break generational cycles if you believe they need to be broken after you see that, But it will also make it easier for you to be able to connect with them so that they can understand how it is that you experience them, so that there can be a healing that happens between you and them while they're still alive. It's easy to try to understand people after they pass on. That's, of course, if you get over the anger and the bitterness of how it is that you might have experienced them when they were around. If you didn't, and you carry that bitterness with you because you feel you're justified and you're not going to abandon because it feels like letting them off the hook and all of that, understand that that will come across in the way it is that you're raising your children. So you will pay it forward in a way that you don't realize you're doing. And I've seen this too many times. It's sad that you have parents and single parents, divorcees, whatever it is, you have them really genuinely sincere, breaking their heads and breaking their hearts over trying to be better for their children. But they don't realize that their desperation to do it, because the desperation is inspired by the anger and the bitterness and the hurt and the betrayals that they're still holding on to from their childhood and from their relationship with their parents and all of that. They don't realize that that desperation comes across so intensely to their children that they actually create space, or they create a gap, they create distance between them and their children while they're demanding for their children to be closer to them. Desperation never results in well-informed decisions, nor does the intensity of betrayal or anger or self-loathing or just being driven by all the negatives that you're trying to show you can be better than, or trying to get other people to appreciate your struggle. It's your struggle. You need to reconcile it. You need to come to terms with it. And you need to understand why it is that you might be framing something as toxic or as traumatic, even though it was just unpleasant. We need to keep things real. And we can't keep bowing down to every person's emotional gripe about life. Because if that's the case, that's how you raise a generation of whiners who just won't believe that they are accountable for the state they find themselves in, because they didn't do this, and they didn't create this system, and they didn't make it so difficult to afford a living and all of that. Raise children who are solution orientated, not children who are focused on identifying problems and looking for escapes and looking for distractions because the problems are larger than them. And you're not going to be able to raise children like that if you can try and protect them from how life works. And gentle parenting is an extreme. It is not how life works. People don't wait for you to be comfortable with how it is that they need you to show up for them once you're outside of the protected space of your home with your parents. So if you're raising your children to believe that they must always be gentle in every single way, you are actually raising them without boundaries. And you are giving them such fragile boundaries that they need others to respect, that you are not equipping them for life. You are equipping them for failure. You are equipping them for struggle. You are equipping them for being doormats. Because they're going to be bleeding hearts all over the place, and they're not going to understand why it is that people keep taking advantage of them. You change the world by carrying forward the wisdom of the previous generations and building on it, not discarding it because you think you know better. If you're discarding it because you think you know better without having had the experience that informs why it is that you should know better, you're simply acting from a place of insecurity and arrogance. Arrogance being the outcome of insecurity. So be careful. Be careful what you sign up for. Be careful what you assume you are better at than those that came before you. And be careful of assuming that the wisdom of the ages is suddenly redundant because we have so advanced ourselves as humans in the 21st century. We haven't. Look at the world around you. Look at how many places are dangerous to even walk freely at night without worrying about your safety, let alone whether you're a man or a woman or a boy or a girl. Look at the amount of scandals coming out about human trafficking, about organ theft from living humans, from cargo containers that are filled with children that are being transported across the oceans between countries because they're being sold and they're being harvested. You really think that we know better than the past? We don't. It's our arrogance about believing that we do know better than the past that is creating most of the problems we are facing today. So by all means, break unhealthy generational cycles. But in fact, I would rather go and say that we shouldn't break it. We need to improve on the generational cycles. We need to take the wisdom of what we were raised with and build on that, not discard it and replace it. Because there is wisdom in it. The fact that you're here able to have a conversation about this proves that there's wisdom in how it is that you were raised. Just because you are focused on all the negatives, all the unpleasantness, all the so-called toxic traits and the trauma, doesn't mean that there wasn't goodness in there that you were able to take. And remember, it's always about what you take from life, what you take from relationships, what you take from your experiences in your childhood. It's not what was given to you. What was given to you is purely a resource for you to do something with. What you choose to do with it, that's up to you. And if you're not empowering yourself and your children to realize that, you'll constantly be blaming people for not giving you what you needed to be better. I hope that gives you food for thought, and I hope those of you who are dead set on wanting to break generational cycles and generational trauma and all of that, that you pause and take a very sober look at what it is that you're actually doing and accomplishing versus what you intended to. And if you don't have healthy sounding boards for that, there's a much higher probability of you getting it wrong. And you'll only realize you got it wrong when you see your child struggling to find their identity despite you having raised them in the best way you possibly could. Life is not easy, but it is very, very worth it if you are in it to experience the joys, the highs and the lows, without labeling everything as toxic, as traumatic, as some or other mental illness or some other label that we want to throw at it. Live life. Stop labeling it, stop judging it, and stop avoiding it because you need to feel safe. Let me know what you think. I hope that was of value, and I look forward to being challenged, especially on the gentle parenting stuff. I know a lot of people are going to take exception to some of my comments on gentle parenting, but think about it. There's no such thing as gentle parenting. The moment you have to go to a gentle parenting space, it means that you're going too far. You have to strike a balance. There has to be firmness, there has to be resolve, there has to be healthy boundaries, there has to be an understanding of your place, because if children were capable of making informed decisions about consequences that they're going to be facing resulting from the choices they make, even the secularist courts wouldn't impose age restrictions on when a child is allowed to be treated as an adult. So think about that. The most detached philosophies from tradition even recognize that children are not equipped to be able to make sound decisions about life. So please, with your gentle parenting, stop giving your children a say in everything. They need to learn to trust your guidance. They don't need to learn to be your friend. Take care.